Hi there, and welcome to the channel. The main reason for making this video is that people in the West are terribly misinformed about what is really happening in the Russia-Ukraine war, especially about its history and everything that eventually led these two countries, who share a history spanning almost their entire existence, to hate and kill each other. It's heartbreaking to see Slavic and Orthodox Christian brothers on both sides giving their lives for the evil and foreign interests behind all of this. For us to understand the truth about this conflict, we need to go back to the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union and what followed all the way up to this day. We must know that Russia and its people were in a terrible situation, mainly because of the bad and radical economic changes, if they can even be called that happened during this same period. The most notable of these changes was the so-called shock therapy, which was a large mass privatization project supported by the IMF and the collective West, and of course, the US government led by Bill Clinton. Unsurprisingly, the man behind this project on the Russian side was their Jewish Prime Minister, Yegor Gaidar. The purpose of this shock therapy project was for Russia's largest and most important state industries to be sold to oligarchs and shady international businessmen for ridiculously low prices. And all this was made possible by the Russian president at the time, Boris Yeltsin, who, after everything that Russia endured during his presidency, we can, with a calm mind, say was a terrible leader and a Western puppet who was considered a clown by Western leaders. This period was infamously called the looting of Russia, and it was clear why. The Russian people endured a terrible economic crisis, and with it, a social crisis as well. Alcohol and drug consumption were at an all-time high, while life expectancy was desperately low. Millions of Russians lost their life savings due to enormous inflation. Crime and prostitution were everywhere as well. You would think that it couldn't get worse from here, but then the First Chechen War came. Chechen terrorists started a separatist war that killed thousands. Another sad thing about all this is that the Western propaganda machine conveniently uses this dark period in Russia's history to describe modern Russia, which couldn't be further from the truth. After the Chechen War ended in 1996, another evil took its place in the form of the so-called Seven Bankers, led by a known Russian Jewish oligarch, Boris Berezovsky, who loved to boast that he and his buddies controlled over 50% of the complete Russian economy. For a country as big as Russia, even in crisis, that is a pretty big chunk for only 7 people. When we analyze all this, you can't deny that the Western powers were using this terrible situation Russia was in and taking advantage wherever they could. You may not want to take my word for it, but you can't deny the letter that the US ambassador to Russia at the time, William Burns, wrote, where he admitted exactly that. He felt and knew that the collective West was beating Russia in every possible way while it was down, instead of helping. Not only was Russia's internal situation dire, but its external status was also getting worse with NATO's eastward expansion closer to Russian borders. This was NATO and the US not respecting their own promise after the fall of the Soviet Union, a promise made in 1990 during the reunification of Germany. Even though there was never a written agreement about NATO not expanding eastward, the promise given by then US Secretary of State James Baker and other Western officials was real. Since the Western powers were in a far better position than Russia, this promise disappeared as if it was never there, and this is clear proof of the collective West acting in bad faith against a much weakened and desperate Russia. Now you might ask, why does Russia care if independent countries want to join NATO? It is not up to them. Well, the response to that would be the NATO bombing of Belgrade, Serbia in 1999, a bombing that occurred without the approval of the UN Security Council. This set a worrying precedent that many neutral intellectuals were concerned about. The idea that the strong is always right. This should worry every large and powerful country that NATO is expanding toward. It also showed the world that NATO is not only a defensive alliance, as they claim, but an offensive one as well, especially when it suits their financial and political interests. A year later, everything would change, a change that no one expected. Russia got a new president by the name of Vladimir Putin. His predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, went into history. The first thing Putin did was crack down on the previously mentioned oligarchs who looted Russia in the 90s, especially the infamous 7 bankers led by Boris Berezovsky, who fled to the UK in fear of criminal prosecution. Yegor Gaidar, the former prime minister who started the so-called shock therapy, fled to Ukraine, also afraid of prosecution. Not all of them managed to flee. The most notable example is Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the richest man in Russia at the time. He was prosecuted and imprisoned for 10 years. After all this, the most surprising thing happened. Russia's standard of living began to grow, the economy started to recover, life expectancy rose. Simply put, Russia was doing better in every possible way. With this, the popularity of President Putin skyrocketed, and his power grew by the day. He managed to elevate Russia from one of its darkest periods, and regardless of whether you like or dislike the man now, this feat cannot be denied or taken from him. As all this was happening, you would expect that the powers in the Western world would be happy for another nation recovering and improving the lives of its citizens, but the opposite happened. Relations between Russia and Western countries, especially the US, grew exponentially worse. This was most visible during the Second Chechen War, which started in 1999, where Chechen rebels were openly supported by the US. The foreign minister of the Chechen separatists at the time, Ilyas Akhmadov, was allowed to visit the US State Department. Imagine Texas starting a separatist war against the US and Russia openly supporting them in any way they can. I don't think that would go over well with the US government. Regardless, Putin once again came out victorious, put an end to the war, and managed to reincorporate Chechnya into the Russian Federation. This made him even more popular and gave him even more power than before. Some would say this unsuccessful separatist war, supported by the US, came back to bite them in the end. Now, after all this, we can clearly see the hostility and hatred of the collective West toward Russia. But despite all this, Vladimir Putin did not take any drastic steps or measures against these acts and continued to respect the mutual treaties Russia had signed. He even tried to fix relations and direct his country toward a more Western-oriented future, but without success, as he was repeatedly refused, especially by the US government led by George Bush. All this culminated when NATO continued its expansion toward Russian borders and welcomed multiple ex-Soviet countries into the alliance. I would leave it at this for now, but I plan to continue this topic up to the start of and during the Russia-Ukraine war with the purpose of better understanding this terrible and bloody conflict. I believe that the only way to change something is by being properly informed and understanding the complexity of any issue that may cause destructive consequences, especially when the issue is war, because we all know that the first victim of war is the truth. If you find this video somewhat interesting and would like to know more about this topic, leave a like and subscribe. It would help me a lot and also motivate me to continue making these types of videos. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.